I always tend to have boring titles, but I have to say, I thought I had a really creative title at first, and it was kibosh. And my title was, I'm not Canadian and I don't believe in God, can I have a job? Which will make sense in a minute. So I'm going to talk to you about sort of two new issues that have come up in the past year with respect to human rights. One of them is that there's a decision from August of last year from the Human Rights Tribunal that now recognizes atheism as being protected under the Human Rights Code as a creed. And the second one is the Human Rights Commission's new policy on removing the, quote, Canadian experience barrier. So I'm going to start first by talking to you about the RC and District School Board of Niagara decision. So RC was the father of a child registered at the Niagara School Board. And the school board had a policy at the time that allowed the Gideons to distribute the New Testament, subject to the student council approving it and subject to the parents consenting to their children receiving this New Testament. Now, RC was atheist. And in 2009, he attended a session where the New Gideons were presenting to the student council because they wanted to distribute the New Testament, and he became very offended by this. And so he requested that the school board give him permission to distribute an atheist publication. And interestingly enough, the evidence in the case was that he was seeking to distribute the publication not to promote atheism, but because he wanted to demonstrate that other parents could equally be offended by this type of distribution, and so he shouldn't have to be offended by the Gideons wanting to distribute the New Testament. Based on the policy at the time, his request was denied because specifically the policy said only the Gideons can distribute the New Testament. He filed a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal, and before the decision came out, but after this particular decision, the school board actually amended its policy to become a little bit more inclusive. And specifically, they no longer limited it to just the Gideons. They essentially said that anybody could request to have religious materials distributed. It would still be subject to student council approval. It would still be subject to the parents consenting, but the publication had to be identified in the Multi-Faith Information Manual, which was just a manual that identified a number of publications with respect to several religions. So RC once again made a second request to have an atheist publication distributed at the school, and it was once again rejected by the school board on two bases. The first basis was atheism is not a religion, and the second basis was the publication that he sought to distribute wasn't identified in the Multi-Faith Information Manual. So the Human Rights Tribunal addressed both the old policy and the new policy in its decision, and it essentially disagreed with the school board and found that it had constituted discrimination. And it addressed sort of two key points. One is atheism, which is you all know is really not having a belief in a God or a higher being. Is that creed and therefore protected by the Human Rights Code? And they relied very heavily on the French definition of creed in the code, which is, for those of you who speak French, croyance, which is a belief. So in essence, a very broad definition. And they said, atheism is a belief in no higher being, and so it's still a belief, and it's very validly held. The second issue they took quite a bit of concern with was the Multi-Faith Information Manual, which sounded like a very reasonable basis upon which to sort of make decisions about what you will and will not distribute, clearly was not expansive enough to recognize all quote-unquote religions or beliefs. And they gave an example of the Falun Gong, which had been recognized as a creed back in 2010 by the tribunal, but was not found in this particular publication. So they granted, he wasn't seeking monetary damages, and they basically found discrimination on the basis of creed. Interestingly enough, not necessarily as a result of, but you should know that the Human Rights Commission is looking at amending its policy on creed, which has been in effect since 1996. And it's looking like it's going to be quite broad. In fact, they've made some suggestion that things like veganism may be protected under creed. And I'm advised by a colleague of mine that apparently a lot of people still identify as Jedi Knights. So if any of you are currently employing any Jedi Knights, be wary of your potential duty to accommodate. So the second one I'm going to talk to you briefly about is the 2013 policy the Human Rights Commission released on quote-unquote removing the Canadian experience. And as many of you will know, the policies themselves are not binding on the tribunal, but if asked to review them, they're required to review them and consider them in their decisions. Now, the purpose behind the policy itself is based largely on the fact that the immigrant population in Ontario and in Canada are disproportionately and significantly disproportionately either unemployed or underemployed. And one of the cases that they've used as a reason for the requirement for such a policy is a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision in Singh and Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board. And just briefly, Dr. Singh was a very well-educated gentleman, but he was foreignly trained. He had an undergrad from India, he had a master's degree from Berlin, and he had a PhD from Berlin. In addition, he had a management certificate. Very qualified individual, came to Canada, and the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board was looking to hire a regulatory officer, and it had certain requirements. One of them was education in environmental sciences, which Dr. Singh had, and also required, quote, northern experience. The job was in Yukon. He applied, he was successful in getting an interview and scored quite high on the interview. Ultimately, though, he wasn't hired for two reasons. A, he was overqualified, and B, he didn't have northern experience. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found this to be discriminatory basically for two reasons, or they highlighted sort of two key points. The northern experience really has a disproportionate or adverse impact on foreign-trained individuals. And it's something that in many cases is easily accommodated. Bring the individual on, put them in the field for X number of weeks, and they may very well be able to learn or gain that experience. The second piece of it was the overqualification, and we hear this a lot. The tribunal took great exception with this, and they made a distinction between someone who is Canadian trained, Canadian educated, or a foreign trained individual, and they said somebody who's quote unquote overqualified but has Canadian experience, Canadian training, can just get out there in the job market and apply to several other jobs. This is much more difficult for the immigrant population, so it's adversely impacting the immigrant population by saying you're overqualified. So the lesson to learn here is A, make sure you don't have any Jedi Knights, but B, take a look at your policies and your procedures and how are you addressing the issues of creed or Canadian experience. Are your job postings saying things like Canadian experience required? Do you really need the Canadian experience? Can you accommodate the issue? So again, we're seeing a lot of developments in the human rights world, and I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. Thanks.